Hello and welcome to the Warhammer Podcast, episode 33. I'm your host, Brad. This is my co-host, Eric.
How's it going?
We're going to be covering a topic today that I don't often cover, which is statistics. We are essentially at the end of the first half of War Zone Nephilim's seasons. We are now at the perfect point to be looking at statistics and to be talking about statistics and the meta and, what's good, what's bad, what needs changing, and all that jazz. Without any further ado, let's jump into this.
Sounds good.
All right, let's talk statistics. Welcome back to your least favorite college freshman math class. I'll be your professor today, Dr. Ruler. This is my nuclear physicist co-host, Eric.
Ah, yes, the most sought after and misused tool of modern society, statistics. One of the problems is that in modern society, we get bombarded with statistics just constantly. It's just everywhere. News takes it and runs with it. We've got YouTube algorithms and Twitter likes and whatever that's going on there that just slaps you in the face with statistics over and over again. But that doesn't mean that those statistics are useful, good, or even something that should ever have existed to start with. So there's a lot of traps that you can easily fall into when you're looking at statistics. We'll go over a couple of them that are kind of applicable to the Warhammer statistics that we're going to look at. But, if you're interested, there's YouTube videos out there and Wikipedia articles and all that shit. Let's start with faulty generalization, which is basically taking a particular population and saying that subset works for everything. And similarly, that can be taken to a point of having loaded categorization. So you can make subsets of that overall population to try and get around overgeneralizing. But in making those subsets, you can implement a bias into those categories. For example, in Warhammer, there are subfactions. So do you take the overgeneralization of the entire faction, or do you split it up further and further into subfactions? As such, you can increase the amount of bias in the actual data to the point that it's not particularly useful. Another part of generalization for the Warhammer stuff is what type of terrain is being used. Is that something that you're actually looking at? What's the tournament style? All of that is stuff that we can granularly look at, but these statistics don't.
Then we've got false causality.
Yeah, that's the basic correlation doesn't imply causation. Everybody's kind of heard of that, and everybody sort of understands that, just because A implies B, B doesn't imply C kind of stuff. But when it comes to the Warhammer stuff, we can look at it very distinctly of player skill levels. If you have one player that's their first game versus another player that's played for the last 20 years, that matters into what the outcome is. So you don't actually know that one faction is more balanced or overpowered or whatever, because you don't have the full nature of why something happened. It's just data that doesn't have the actual causation.
And for an example in 40K, the most obvious is the Space Marine issue of it is by far the most popular faction in the game. We'll get to the numbers in a bit.
Yeah.
Because of a large section of it being casual players, you end up with incredibly skewed statistics until you start narrowing down in there, and you may end up with the wrong assumption about the factions balance because of how it looks in a vacuum before you start pruning for people of a certain talent level and everything else.
Right, which actually is one of those things of a lot of statistics are looked at either from a mathematician viewpoint where they have no understanding of what the data actually is, or on the opposite side of it's somebody that doesn't really know stats but knows the, Warhammer and are applying stats in a way that doesn't really make sense. That kind of happens. Another problem with the Warhammer data set is just honestly the lack of data. The amount of raw data that we have just is small. So when you have limited amounts of data, your estimated error becomes more and more important and becomes more and more difficult to actually figure out what it actually is. And that means that extrapolating from a small data set to the overall larger behavior of the data set is more and more difficult because the central limit theorem actually breaks down and doesn't really work on the low amounts of data that we have access to. We're looking at like 5,000 people. That's not that many games. So extrapolating from that to a larger behavior is just kind of breaks down.
And it gets worse when you remember that the 5,000 people is not a snapshot of a single instance. Some of these 5,000 data points are the same data points at different points in time. You have people going to tournaments week after week. You also have the problem of, in general, the results from week 12 is different than the results from week 1 because the meta has adapted. Win rates are going to slide dramatically over the first few weeks and tend to converge into a more stable meta by the last half. So you end up with a very skewed data set if you use the whole thing, which we kind of have to get enough data points to even talk about in an interesting way.
Right, but looking at week 1 versus week 12, there's more variation on week 1 because the meta is not really figured out yet. The one last thing I wanted to bring up before we actually get into this, I know it kind of went off track a bit far, but we are going to bring up a couple of posts. We'll put them in the show notes. One of them is StatCheck.
Yes, we talked about it previously. So StatCheck was previously like that Tableau site that had an awful URL that we threw in a couple episodes back. They have a wonderful looking site now. I found out through their new site that doesn't look like cancer that they even have a podcast that at some point I'll be listening to.
It's nowhere near as sketchy looking as it was back then.
I'm not afraid opening this website. It's fantastic.
Yeah, but because the StatCheck website is primarily a data visualization tool that does bring into statistics being misused as a visual representation. So oftentimes that's done purposefully, trying to make the data look like something more than it actually is. That's not exactly what's going on StatCheck because StatCheck is kind of, here's just the data. But because of how it's set up in a way that you get to pick and choose what you see, it's very easy for the person using it to misuse it and to lead to misleading data visualization just because, you know, you're clicking buttons and it's looking pretty and you're going, oh, that's neat, when, you know, there's only 6 people that are, you know, playing that subfaction, so it doesn't matter. So, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to get out of the way of problems with statistics. All of that said, numbers are bad, but let's get into numbers because they're fun.
Yes. So the other thread that we're going to be using as a reference here when we made this episode is a user named Jafarin on the Warhammer competitive subreddit made a post earlier this week about Meta Tuesday, which was Meta Monday's meta post, where the user compiled all of the data from Meta Monday over the last 11 weeks and put it all together into a nice summarized post. I am pulling a bunch of numbers from here as well because it's just easier for me to use these numbers. They don't 100% match the stats on StatCheck because they pull from slightly different pools. You can figure out all those details yourself. It's a perfect example of why you have to be careful when we're talking about stats.
Yeah.
Another thing is the statistic gathering itself is flawed. Okay? Here's the easiest way to find this out. Go on StatCheck. Wonderful. The best we can hope for currently with the tools available. Go to Necrons. Evil Sons is a subfaction in Necrons. They also have their most winning subfaction as a list of Drukhari subfactions, so you should try that at your next tournament and see how it goes for you.
I'm pretty sure that's not legal. You might get a judge call.
The point here being, all the data we're working with had to go through human hands. It's not automated. There was room for error. These numbers might not be exact. You get the drill.
Yeah.
That said, both of these were wonderful reads. Using StatCheck is just amazing fun. It's so much better now that it's not that ugly Tableau page.
It's the kind of thing that, like, if you're bored at lunch and have access to the computer, just spend half an hour while you're eating and just click buttons. It's just fun.
All right, so let's actually get into the statistics finally. Sorry for all the lecturing. So here's the fun part. We are at week 12 of Nephilim when you hear this. We're using the first 11-ish weeks of data. During these weeks, there have been 91 40K tournaments that have made it into the Meta Monday posts or whatever that had enough people to be worth checking out.
Yeah.
5,370 player entries total, whether some of those are the same player playing every week or whatever. So we've got 5,370 data points to work with, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually a horrendously small scope to deal with here from the stats standpoint. It's bad.
It's pretty abysmal.
We only have an average of 59 people per tournament, which again makes some of these a bit awkward to get good stats data out of. We're just going to roll with it. It's the best we can hope for.
There's that biasing going on there because some tournaments are 100 and a lot of tournaments are 20. So average 59.
So that's the pool we're working with. To show you how rough this gets, these factions all had less than 100 players over the last 11 weeks. Admech, Genestealer Cults, and Chaos Demons, those three codices didn't breach 100. None of them breached 80. If we stretch it out to also include the Space Marine sub-faction extra book bullshit, you can add Deathwatch and Black Templar to that list.
Yeah, I mean, Admech's in not a great spot, but I definitely understand Genestealers. I always forget about Genestealers. Every time. I'm like, oh yeah, Genestealers is a thing.
Earlier this week, we were discussing something else, and I thought Eric was taking the piss, and it turned out he actually just had forgotten Genestealers was an actual army.
Every fucking time. It just like, I relearn about it every week.
But to put this in perspective, all of those that I just named had less players than there were tournaments so far. So the data on these isn't great.
Yeah.
We could argue something is wrong with them in the first place if this few people are willing to play them.
Sure.
Like, that is its own problem, but it may not be a balance concern so much as a complexity or price or 50 other things. The fact that Chaos Demons has an ancient, awful codex and relies on Psychic Awakening a single page of rules to save the whole faction.
Yeah, all of that false causality stuff of trying to attribute reasons that we don't actually know.
Yeah, so let's talk about all the factions, though. We'll start off. The most popular faction, by a country mile, when you sum it up,
is Necrons.
No, is Space Marines.
Oh.
Necrons is because you end up with this awkward thing where you have to sum up all of the Space Marines into the actual codex because for some reason the Special Snowflake Army has to list out by sub-faction rather than the actual faction.
But put all together,
Space Marines is 803 tournament entries out of 5,370. Quick math, that is almost exactly 15%.
Nice.
In Space Marines, Blood Angels were the most popular subfaction to play, with over 200 entries alone. It was 216. And on the opposite end of things, the most unplayed subfaction is Raven Guard with 10 over 91 tournaments.
Wow. That's impressive. But I mean, that's a lot of players. So how are Space Marines doing? Because clearly, if that many people are taking them, they must be good.
So Space Marines, there is a couple ways you can look at things. Either the amount of people who can get first place, the percentage of the people playing it who get first place, the win percent itself. They all have flaws when you look at them. The more popular a faction is, the lower its turnover to first place could be. We have a more famous thing in the Magic community, which is day 2 turnover rates. Warhammer doesn't have that because they don't drop half the players on day 1 because they only play 3 games.
Because it takes substantially longer.
But that said, the easiest way to look at it is probably just win rates. And if you're playing the most popular subfaction, you are also playing the most winning subfaction in this case, which is Blood Angels, with a pretty respectable 48% win rate.
Yeah.
If Space Marines looked like most factions, they would end up all the way at the bottom in my boring, not quite in a good spot, but not in the worst spot. Between 45 and 50, where
yeah.
You want a bitch because you want a couple buffs in your book, but you're not the worst thing going on and you're not broken, so you'll be mostly ignored.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because Space Marines isn't like that, you've got 3/4 of players not playing the correct sub-faction and playing all sorts of dog water, and you end up with fantastic things like Ultramarines, where you can't pull a 40% win rate, but for some reason, Ultramarines still ends up with more people than Genestealer cults. So let's move on from Space Marines and get into Necrons and Tyranids. These two managed to be in second and third place for popularity over the last 11 weeks here, and by their powers combined, they actually beat Space Marines by over 100 tournament entries. Necrons have 480 alone, Nids have another 424. Both of them actually managed to have over 50% win rates, which helps their popularity compared to Space Marines, where they're kind of fighting against their win rate, lowering their popularity, and they're still at 15% of the field.
Yeah, I mean, Nids have been strong for a while now. They've had some hits against them, but they're still solid.
Man, you were saying the greatest understatements. Nids have been strong.
Yeah.
So Nids, out of everybody, is probably the most concerning at 57% win rate, like including all sub-factions together. Their worst, most dangerous sub-faction by a mile is Leviathan at 61% win rate alone. It's their most popular, obviously.
Which is high, but it's not as busted as we've seen previously.
No, we're grading on the Warhammer curve here, where we had Drukhari and Admech at over 70% for like 6 months. We had Tyranids at like almost 80% at one point. Same with like Harlequins and Craft World. Like, we're a lot better off at, you know, the best sub-factions in the game are a little over 60 and need to get knocked down a bit.
It is interesting that Necrons has sort of the most or second most amount of players, given that until very recently they were pretty trash.
Yes, they're probably the biggest glow up via balanced data slates.
No, they are. They absolutely are. They're the biggest winners on that. But I guess there's always been a solid following, even when they were bad. People just enjoy Necron.
They're just a very popular faction in general in 9th. Obviously, they're very popular because they're the face of 9th edition. Like, they're getting a lot of external things going their way to make them actually popular. The thing that's been working against them the whole edition is an abysmal win rate that, because of the changes on the back half of Nakmund and now the beginning of Nephilim, they've shot up in win rate, and their popularity has come up with it to make them in just flat out second place in popularity.
Yeah.
So then we can move into Chaos Space Marines, which is in 4th place here, 376 entries, but you have to load that because they actually missed the first week or 2 or 3, depending on how slow people were to adapt the codex. So they're actually slightly better off than it looks on popularity because they're not the whole season.
Yeah, and they were not really a faction before it, so...
No, they suffered from demons where you'd occasionally have someone spike a tournament because they knew the army in and out.
Yeah, and nobody else had played against it because, lol, Chaos Space Marines, what are you doing?
But here's the weird thing. Unlike most armies, where they're played like exclusively the top sub-faction or 2 sub-factions, like Necrons is like literally 1 sub-faction. Spoilers, OBSEC all.
Yeah.
Please clap.
Yeah, I was like, there's a clearly best option on that one.
CSM, on the other hand, has like 4 or 5 that are like within, 50% of each other. They're all very popular. And unlike Space Marines, which is what your mind immediately goes to from that point, Space Marines, it seems to be like a more loreful army thing where they don't care about how bad the rules for their sub-faction are, and they just flock to like sub 40% win rate Ultramarines anyway.
Yeah, there's like, this is the list that I painted. I have backstory on all of them. I don't care, man.
Yeah, my super special character has how he fought in this war in M39.31.
Right.
Yeah, no. So the CSM sub-factions are actually all hovering at like a respectable 45 to 55% win rate, at least for the ones being played.
Nice, nice.
The exception is actually Creations of Bile, which is above this window and is probably due for a toning down.
Yeah, it seems to be quite high, but again, there's not that many data points yet for it, so...
No, but it has jumped in popularity over the last few weeks to actually be like, hey, people have figured out this is a thing.
Yeah, it seems more and more like the meta's adapting to it being strong.
And if I'm going to throw out a guess here, I'm going to say that it popped up in popularity too late for it to be on this data slate. So chances are it will live at least.
It'll be a continued thing.
Yeah, at least another 3 months it'll live. But it is interesting that CSM, you've got 4 or 5 options for sub-factions that are all in the window. And like, man, that sounds amazing coming from all of my armies.
Yeah, that is nice. And I'm sure that Sisters, the next one, is also really healthy, right?
So let's talk about the elephant in the room named Bloody Rose. Adeptus Sororitas could basically just be renamed Bloody Rose at this point.
Yeah. Like...
I'm pretty sure it's like 85 or 90% of the games, which with Necrons you could say it's like the same ratio, but with Necrons it's a custom subfaction, one trait that's universal, and then the other one is like a 90% pick on top of that. But like Sororitas, it's you're picking Bloody Rose. There's some outliers. There was like a winning turning list like last week for us, probably 2 ago for everyone listening. That one was Ardent Shroud, I think. So like there exists other things, but the problem is Bloody Rose has that main character syndrome thing where they got the extra book for no fucking reason because that's how this edition works.
Yes. So it kind of became one of those that like they're the strongest, and then they also hit Sisters on like having additional options to get other things.
Yes. So Sister suffers from the same thing that a couple different armies had to varying extents, where Sisters is probably the biggest example of it, of super niche data sheets, super niche subfactions that boost specific data sheets.
Yep.
And they were picking, multiple small like patrols and having each one be a different subfaction so that they would have a army of units all being buffed correctly.
Yeah, and you would have like a good army, not just like here's this thing, it does that well.
Yeah. So the argument against that was, of course, well, if you put your shooting guys in the shooting subfaction, you put your chainsaw ones in the melee subfaction, then that's too easy unga bunga. So we'll just make it where you can only pick one subfaction and then you can't pick the best for everything. The problem there is you've just made the problem worse.
Yeah, now you just pick Bloody Rose.
It's just pick Bloody Rose and just play the melee spam stuff. And Bloody Rose still, because it got the stupid main character second book for no reason, you end up with the ability to boost 1 or 2 shooty units in it still. And so you just end up with Bloody Rose the army.
Yeah, it's disappointing. But like I kind of understand why they did it, but yeah, it is disappointing.
It made sense overall because of other armies, but the problem is Sisters was not built for it.
Right. So what's next on the list then?
So now we have the Problem Children.
Problem Children? We haven't even talked about mine yet. We got Grey Knights and Orcs. I haven't heard about them. They're fine.
Yeah, so we have AdMech, Imperial Guard, Space Marines for people who refuse to pick correct subfactions, and Grey Knights. These are the 4 armies that managed to hit below 45% win rate. These are your we need help.
Yeah, and honestly, I think Grey Knights is not too bad.
It could be worse.
It's close enough to 45 that like a few better players playing it for a couple weeks, it probably would have been fine. AdMech is in a fucking dumpster fire.
I think Grey Knights has the opposite problem. Grey Knights is one of those factions where, like, when you filter down to if your opponent is a good player, like veteran players,
yes,
your win rate plummets.
Right. Because, I mean, yeah, that's just kind of like Psyker armies.
Yeah.
If you know how to play against it, you know how to win. Because their secondaries are a problem. They're not balanced.
Oh, secondaries is a whole different angle to go at from this.
Yeah.
So IG is not really a problem that it's in the problem child category because it's still playing 8th edition.
I mean, it's a problem because they still don't have their codex and it's still soon TM.
The edition's still young. It's only been 2 years. They'll get it with at least 4 months left before 10th edition. It's fine.
Yeah, right.
AdMech needs help.
Yeah, AdMech's just, I mean, they're getting punished for the problems that they did previously. Space Marines is not too bad because, like, it has options. It's just people not choosing them kind of thing.
Space Marines is weird, though. So the first argument, I can already hear angry people commenting. The first argument on Space Marines is our subfactions aren't like everybody else's. I have to buy extra models to play the best subfaction. My response to that is tough shit. You played the subscription service. Like, you're playing games as a service of the army.
It really is.
Your problem is with the army you picked, not the actual game. Let's say you don't want to go outside of the base codex to where you might need extra models.
Yeah.
Just play a good sub-faction like Iron Hands.
Yep.
And you're above the 45% point. Even like Salamanders is at like 45% win rate. Again, we're at the lower end of actually having data here. We're at like below Gene Stealer cults of data.
It's not a good place to be.
But there is options to play Space Marines better than Ultramarines, or God forbid you're playing something like the one guy playing Raven Guard.
Lol. On the other end, there's the armies that are perhaps problems because they're too good.
Yeah, NIDS is the first one. Harlequins is the one we haven't mentioned yet. They're both above the 55% line where you would like things to cap out at. For those who've never done stats for a game before, 55% to 45% is seen as an acceptable window for most games for balance, especially slower to balance games like Warhammer, where you can't get like weekly patches.
Right. If you're not able to play constantly 24/7, queue up to your, MMR and get matchmaking and stuff like that, you have to accept that there's not going to be a perfect 50% all across the board.
Yeah, the company just won't have the data to get everything right anyway.
Yeah. There's also, it's not like pure skill. There's also a certain amount of randomness to it, which given the amount of data can be filtered out and all that. But, 45% to 55% is where it makes sense for it to be a fairly balanced.
So the two outliers again, NIDS and Harlequins, both above the line, which is kind of funny because both of them ate huge nerfs last data slate. It's hilarious how much they got nerfed and that they still managed to be the two best armies in the game.
Yeah.
There are sub-factions like in CSM that are above the line, so it's quite possible we see CSM get a slight kick, either specifically to those sub-factions or just in general to like point increases on certain models that those ones are abusing, whatever it is.
Yeah, like the Creations of Bile that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, Creation of Bile is probably FAQ, because like it's literally because of the Harlequins fight on death ability they have. And Word Bearers was the one that I joked about when we were reading the Codex originally, where I was like,
yeah,
cool, this is that faction that no one played last edition, and they went, what sub-faction did no one play last edition? Make that one stupid busted, where it's like, it just randomly has +1 to hit, reroll all wounds or some crap. And you're like, who wrote this? Can they write the Demon Codex instead of whoever the fuck wrote that?
Oh, I can't wait till we do that episode.
I can, because I'm sad.
Oh, dude, it's going to be hilarious to hear you just go off on an absolute insane rant. But what do you got next?
So we have the weirdest data point, which is, it's kind of adorable. It's the Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights. Both have an exact 50% win rate, going by the Meta Monday results.
Nice.
And it's just kind of adorable that they both have over 200 tournament entries each. Like, it's not a small scale. We're talking about popular armies in the scale we're dealing with. Both of them managed to hit like the exact 50% win-loss ratio. And I know that I have complaints with the current Chaos Knights meta way to play them. I know that our Imperial brethren have a lot of complaints about how they have to play. Neither player base is 100% happy with their codex, but if you play them the most meta way, even if you kind of hate how that army plays, you end up with an actual perfect balance, which is kind of weird. The paired codices ended up being like the most balanced things.
Yeah, I do like that, like, the pair of them are at 50%. It's not just like, oh, Imperial Knights or, oh, Chaos Knights. It's like, nah, both of them are hitting 50%. Hell yeah.
And they're not a copy and paste book. Like,
no, they're not.
The actual meta lists are different.
Yeah.
It is just weird that works out.
There's still a bunch of other factions.
These are my unremarkables. TM.
Oof.
This is Tau, Craftworld, Death Guard, Thousand Sons, Custodes, Drukhari, Gene Stealers, and Orcs. Gene Stealers, you could say their unpopularity makes them remarkable.
Yeah, I was like, Gene Stealers is in a weird spot for that statement.
But like the other 7 of these armies are all quite popular, totally fine. Like you'll see them all the time. There's at least 1 per tournament on average, usually 2+. None of them are over 50% win rate. None of them are below 45. Like almost all of them have some complaints about their current balance. Thousand Suns is held up by a single data sheet. They try to spend more CP than exists now. You've got Gene Stealers who were just completely forgotten by GW and the player base. Orcs wishes they had the ability to play like they did in 8th edition as at least a viable option, even if it's not the best list.
Yeah.
Custodes has their own complaints about how they may have been slightly over-nerfed, while other armies were not nerfed enough. They all have their various complaints, but none of them are outside of like, oh man, they're doing so good right now, and it's not like, oh man, they're doing garbage. So it's like they might get a little attention. It'd be nice if they got some spice up.
Yeah, I don't see it happening. I think these ones are in a fine spot, especially because a bunch of them were things that had to get nerfed.
Yeah, we don't want to go back to 70% win rate Drukhari again, because I'm pretty sure people will riot.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if there was, minor changes to some of these, but people might be disappointed with how they get treated. I just think these are basically going to be stuck here till next edition. And then lastly, we've got demons. I'm just giving you a complete pass on talking about you because we just got our new codex. Next week will be the beginning of seeing the new demons codex. I expect it'll be wildly different, either up or down.
Yeah.
Possibly one, then immediately the other after a single nerf. We'll talk about demons in another week.
I can't wait.
But I think we'll see interesting shifts in demons over the next 12 weeks, and it'll be fun to talk about them at the end of that, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, overall, we're not in a bad spot.
No.
Where we're at right now. Like, there's a few problems on the low end, a few problems on the high end, but overall, it's reasonably healthy, especially compared to what we've had in the last year.
All right, but that's enough of this topic. Let's get out of here for the week and hit the outro.
Sounds good.